Hello, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and kick this off. So I've heard there's no food left. No, I'm just joking. That's just an attention. There's tons of food, so continue to help yourselves. My name is Joe Martin. I'm the SC leader here at Veeam, covering the region. So from here on east to like Michigan, Ohio. So about 11 states supporting public sector customers, like I think most, if not all of you, in commercial accounts. And when I found out about this event, I said I'd be happy to come here to Des Moines. I'm out of Chicago. I was asked why I didn't do the drive. I said I did it once, and there's not much to see, so I will just fly. So no offense. The Illinois side is also very flat. But anyways, I figured, when I'm trying to think of topics, and I shared with Amy, why don't we talk a little bit about ransomware, security. I know, you heard a little bit about security earlier. And it just makes a lot of sense from a Veeam perspective to talk about that too. We're hearing about ransomware events happening on, seems like it's a daily basis these days. In fact, I was with a customer last week that got hit, and they're in the middle right now of trying to recover. They're a Veeam customer, so at least they're able to do the recoveries, but regardless. So as we go through this, before I go in specifically on the Veeam part, let's just talk about a little bit of the state of affairs, why we're doing this. Now, I've got some stats here. These are 2020 stats, just because that's the most recent, complete year. If we were to start diving into all the things that have happened in 2021, it'd be interesting to see what updated stats were. But just to take a look at some numbers here. So the FBI has this Internet Crime and Complaint Center. And you can see here, hopefully, it's maybe a little tough. I could have probably picked a better color, but in red there, almost 800,000 complaints came from Americans last year about all sorts of things going on with the internet. Now, not all of that's ransomware. If you look down, you can see a couple thousand of those reports were about ransomware incidents specifically. But if you go a little bit further beyond getting hit by ransomware, but if you just look at the nefarious folks out there attempting to gain access, which how do they do that? Phishing, social engineering things. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But if you look at their attempts to get into an environment, 240,000 of those incidents occur, which is double what we saw in 2019. So again, I'll be very curious to see what those stats look like this year. Now this thing, I love how this thing builds out. It will hopefully build out momentarily. I may need to hit one more button. There we go. Notable events. The font is purposely small so we could try to fit a whole bunch of notable events. Maybe you can read it, maybe you can't. But really the point here is that's a whole lot of stuff going on in just 2020. And again, when we say notable, you can see there's 2 or 3 items per month that were sort of bigger names. But again, there are over a couple thousand ransomware incidents. So if we try to list them all, there'd be many, many slides. And you can see it spans all sorts of things. A school district at the top, Pittsburgh. I imagine it's a decent-sized school district, but probably not the size of Whirlpool. And they got hit as well. So it has nothing to do how big you are, how small you are, what vertical you're in, what industry you're in. None of that matters. They're trying to hit up everybody. And why are they doing that? Well, in some cases, it's actually politics. There are state sponsors of different ransomware gangs. You can see a list here, different countries supporting different gangs. I love some of these names, Cozy Bear, Fancy Bear. I guess they like to talk about bears or something. I don't know the reasoning behind the ransomware gang's names. But the point being is, sometimes it's as simple as that, right? Trying to be political in it. But other times, it has nothing to do with politics. You got people that just love the fame, right? They don't want their individual name in there because they don't want to get caught. But they want to know that I'm part of that group that's being reported on right now on CNN, on MSNBC, on Fox News. I'm the one that caused that. So they're pretty proud of it. And then ultimately, what usually also helps, this slide originally had the $sign symbol, but there is an ISO standard for the Bitcoin symbol, if anybody is wondering, because I Googled it last night because I wanted to be cool. But point is, it's for money, right? I mean, ultimately, they like the fame, the country that they're in may be sponsoring them. What they really want is money. And in fact, I don't have a slide on this, but I'll just mention this. I don't know if you guys knew this, but there's even ransomware as a service. So you don't have to be a guy that knows how to code. You can actually subscribe to a service, and depending upon your subscription level, that determines how much of the profits you get to share in that the ransomware gangs pull in. No joke. So that's what's making this thing pretty scary, right? So talk a little bit more. Ultimately, how do they get in? Yeah, we know about vulnerabilities. We know about Patch Tuesday, right? We know Linux has its own set of issues as well. And so a lot of times we're thinking that's got to be it. There was some patch that didn't get applied. There was a vulnerability. Yes, that happens. But social engineering is also a very key factor, right? There's no audio. I forgot about this. So if you can hear the audio, I'll just describe what looks like Tom Cruise in a video. And if you could hear what he's talking about, he's going to actually talk about a particular cleaning product that also happens to exfoliate your hands. And so you're watching this video and thinking, well, this seems kind of interesting. That is not Tom Cruise. What someone has done is there is an actor who has a similar build as Tom Cruise. He can imitate the voice, and then through the magic of video editing, superimpose Tom Cruise's face on there. So you're watching what you think is a video of someone famous, a celebrity, telling you need to go to this product, go to this website. That's just another form of social engineering. And it's really scary when you think about that. If you could hear the audio of this, you would actually hear, this guy sounds just like Tom Cruise. First time I saw the video, one of my SEs put this together, I even asked him, why did you put a video of Tom Cruise in here? And that's what he had to explain that it's not. So it's very easy to be fooled, right? It's not just the old days where you get an email saying, hey, you've got a UPS package, but we couldn't deliver it. Click on the attachment to see why. That's old hat. Not saying that doesn't happen as well, but that's the real scary thing. And this slide, as we build out, you can see, we still talk about that, right? Phishing emails, the deep fake. So vishing is video phishing, if anyone was wondering. That was also a new term for me. And then also, gift drops. Anyone ever got a USB stick as a giveaway? Hopefully it was clean. I handed them a USB stick with my presentation. They were trusting that I had one that was clean. You don't know where that USB stick's been. I'm just saying. No, I'm just joking there. But the point being is that these are all very clever ways of doing stuff. I used to play games, so when I administered an environment, I administered our IP phone system. I would just send out any caller ID I wanted. So at one point I was playing pranks with my wife and make it look like, because she was mad at me, so I said, I'll make it look like it's her parents calling her, and then she answers it, it's just me, right? Fake caller ID. Something very simple that you can do. But the point being is there are all sorts of ways of doing social engineering, ones that no matter how much of an expert you are, you could still wind up missing. And those are the ways that people are getting into our environments. Now ultimately, oh yeah, by the way, a little stat, half of people who are given a USB stick will use it, because you just assume it's going to be safe. Which again, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. How else do they get in? Well, they're also looking for easy ways in, right? These guys don't want to go and spend hours and hours and hours to figure out how to get in your environment if they could do it very easily. So, passwords. And I'm guilty of this too. I have probably 2 main passwords. Now, granted, I have variations of each of those 2, depending upon, do I consider this a site equivalent to a banking site? Use my super secure one, or is it one I really don't care about? So I use my other one, but again, different flavors of it. But I could probably be counted in that stat where it's 83% of users using the same password on multiple sites. I'm sure some of us are guilty of that as well. So once that password is gotten, then that attacker can go ahead and do something. In fact, I got one more thing. Oh, by the way, 100 passwords per second are stolen. That's a little neat stat. I was with a customer just last week where I went on site just to try to help them a little bit. They actually were in the middle of recovering from a ransomware attack. In their case, someone somehow gained access to the environment, gained access to the Veeam server, ran a script, did some scraping, got VMware credentials, encrypted all the VMDKs. It was one of those ones that's targeting ESXi. Now, even though there's stuff targeting ESXi, any of those things that I've read about at least that's targeting vSphere hosts, they're not attacking some sort of vulnerability in ESXi itself. Rather, they're trying to gain credentials in the environment and then finding any VMware host they can that those credentials will work with, because you can authenticate to the host. You don't have to go through vCenter. And next thing you know, they've got access to everything sitting on it. They can start doing encryption activity. We've had plenty of folks, and I've read about, people have called Veeam support trying to get help restoring because of the fact that vSphere credentials are stolen. So it's not just Windows passwords, Linux passwords, right? You got to think about other things from an administrator level, because all this stuff that you guys are all touching, I mean, think about it. You kind of have keys to the kingdom. Being in IT, and I know this how it was when I was in environment, I had the password to everything, which was all on a piece of paper, kept in a safe. I don't know how safe that was, but that was what we did. So having all those passwords means if one of your machines gets hit, those attackers can really do a lot of damage. So that's why I'm spending a lot of time on this slide talking about passwords being stolen. We're so worried about patching, and I'm not saying patching isn't important, but at this point I think everybody's gotten that message, and that we've got systems in place to do some sort of patch management. We've got procedures, we've got solutions we've purchased to automate patch management. Now we got to worry about other aspects, passwords and social engineering. So speaking of social engineering, a little bit of training. Anyone here ever heard of a company called NoB4? All right, see people shaking their heads. First time I ever heard about them, I was actually presenting on ransomware several years ago, and a customer told me about it. Right? And so if there's anybody not familiar with them, they offer services to educate your users. In fact, Veeam, I don't know if we use NoB4 or someone else, but I'll get emails periodically that I look at and say, that's a phishing email. And so we have a button that IT pushed down that shows up in Outlook. I can click on a button to report an email's phishing, and every time it says, congratulations, you caught a simulated message. But the whole reason for that is to find the people that don't. Interesting stat about NoB4, and I'm not by any means saying NoB4 is the best solution or whatever. It's one I know about. Customer, actually in that same event when I first heard about it, said before they brought in NoB4 when they first brought in NoB4, before they did any training, they went ahead and sent out the phishing emails that NoB4 does to see how many people click on it, and it was roughly half of their users clicked on that email, which again doesn't hurt them. They're not going to a real bad site, right? They're being whisked away to NoB4 saying you did something silly, you need some training. After doing 6 months of training, doing the blast again, it was down to, I think, 5%, I think they said. So it's pretty interesting to see how powerful it was. So that training can help people spot this. Like some things are highlighted, again, a little difficult to see this sample email from Amazon, but anyone who's got a 5th grade level of spelling and grammar will be able to tell this is not from Amazon. But there are other ones that come that every now and then I'll get an email that I have to sit there and think for a second, because it at first does actually look pretty legit. So educating users is one of those ways to try to fight the social engineering aspect. Ultimately, though, when ransomware does come in, doesn't matter what it was, social engineering, passwords, maybe just patching that didn't happen, there's kind of 4 stages that it goes through. So first, there's just the discovery, where they're going to try to find what's in your environment. Then they start testing, what can I get to, what can I not get to in the environment. Another piece, that's an optional one, and I've got slides on each. We'll dive into it a little bit more in a second, but exfiltration, which is stealing of data. And then finally, encryption of the data. The stealing of the data is another interesting one that isn't always talked about, so we'll talk about that in a second. So discovery is important for these guys because they've got to go out there and just find out what resources are out there, right? I've got access to this environment. How many Windows shares are out there, right? How many Linux servers are out there? Do they have VMware in the environment? You know, they're trying to see what are the possible attack vectors that they've got, and do they even think that there's high-value targets? Because if there aren't, it may not be worth their time. Go somewhere else to try to get some Bitcoin. So you see, it's passively find stuff. So they're not going to necessarily do a bunch of probing or whatever. They're trying to do as very nondescript as possible, try to discover shares, address book information, right? Because if I can get access to so-and-so's address book, I can push out something to every single person in that address book. Also, as part of the discovery, what kind of anti-malware? Because if they've got a pretty serious anti-malware, intrusion prevention, intrusion detection solution, again, it may not be worth my time because there's a higher degree chance that they're going to detect what I'm doing. So these are all the things. Am I running on a virtual machine, by the way? Again, that's another sign that they've got VMware, Hyper-V, some sort of hypervisor. And by the way, if they've gained access to something, because initially it's just IPs, host names, those hosts may not be very indicative of who the company is. Who am I hitting? Did I just hit, a jackpot? Have I hit Sony Pictures? or if I hit, a grain elevator. Big difference in what I'm going to get out of those returns. So now I'm going to begin actually testing, all right? Now I've found all these resources that this target has. So can I get access? And in particular, do I have read-write or read-only? If I can only get read-only, again, not worth my time. I can't encrypt anything. I can't delete anything. I can't really do much with it. I can maybe try the exfiltration part, which we'll talk about momentarily. I can steal their data. But ideally, I'd like to be able to not just steal their data. Because if I can steal it, I don't have as much ransom capability with them versus if I can also encrypt or delete their data. Right? And then as part of the testing, start sending out phishing emails. See who actually clicks on it. See how many of these email addresses are valid. See how many of the users are bright. All these things I need to figure out. And if it sounds like I'm being hard on users, again, I was an IT admin for years, so I know what they're capable of, as I'm sure you guys all are. And then again, let's just double check as we're testing to see, is there anything in the environment that's going to try to stop what I'm doing? Right? Because intrusion detection is different from intrusion prevention. Right? If you've got something that can detect, but it's not going to do any kind of remediation, then I got a better chance of causing problems to be able to get some money. So exfiltration is interesting. It's an optional piece. That's what happened in the Sony Pictures thing. So if I remember right, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty certain Sony did not have any data that was actually encrypted. They didn't have data lost. They had data that was stolen, and then they were being told, give us a bunch of money, we're going to start making this stuff public. Right? Because they were in there for months just gathering stuff. That's happened to a lot of folks, unfortunately. Because the scary thing is, even if, let's say, they go ahead and encrypt your data or even delete, it's interesting. I've heard of ransomware that will delete but then still send an email saying, send us Bitcoin so you can decrypt your data. Talk about sneaky. There's nothing to decrypt. They've actually deleted everything. But they're going to try to get some money. But anyways, with exfiltration, it's all still there. Because they may be aware that you've got a good backup system like, I don't know, let's say Veeam. They know you're going to be able to recover, so they don't want to just encrypt because they know if all they do is encrypt/delete and then say, give us some money, you're not going to give them any money. But if they say, we're going to make all this information public that we stole, social security numbers, credit card numbers, if you take payments from customers, all sorts of things, right? Now all of a sudden, it's a little scary. And then what they want to do too is when they exfiltrate that, they want to encode this data and send it someplace kind of in a neutral location initially, right? Because that's a good kind of intermediary aspect. And they also want to determine how long they want to do this. Like how long do they want to just keep stealing data before they're finally going to let you know what they've done, right? Because they probably have to make a determination how much data is there to steal and what industry you're in. Is it valuable enough that they really want to gather forever? Like Sony Pictures, I want to say was 6 months. Versus, if it's public sector, they may say, you know what, we'll just grab some data real quick and let's just get some money and go on to the next one because it doesn't make any sense. We're not going to increase our payout much if we sit here for weeks or months. And so finally, encryption. That's what we all start worrying about at first before some of these other things happen. And what are they going to encrypt, by the way? Production data, for sure. Sometimes they encrypt the backup data. Sometimes they delete the backup data. They want to make it difficult to have access to your backup data. But the key is to encrypt the production data so that they've brought all of that to a screeching halt. Right? That's going to be key when they do this. And the more machines that they can compromise to do the encryption, the faster they can go out and encrypt everything. Because at the end of the day, a single box only has so much compute resources, right? It's only got so much memory, so much CPU. It can only encrypt so much data per second, right? How much network bandwidth does it have because it may be reaching across the network to, say, a file share to encrypt everything. So if it was patching that created the vulnerability, so social engineering gave them the credentials to get in, a lack of patching allowed them to actually get physical access to machines. The more they can get access to, the more they can put their payload and start doing all of these things. Not to mention, if they can spread the load out and use less on each machine, a little bit more difficult to be detected as something's going on. So things to think about. And attack your key resources, right? Email, if that's on premises. There are ways of doing Office 365 encryption as well. I don't know if anyone was aware of that. SQL servers, trying to hit your backup servers. They're going to look at what are, again, high-value targets. Things that, if they go down, are going to pretty much stop everything in their tracks. Right? Those are the things that they're going to worry about. In fact, even on that previous bullet point, if they have access to your storage systems, delete snapshots. Because maybe you're keeping snapshots as another layer of protection. The problem you have, ransomware, when we first talked about it, this is a little sidebar. All we worried about was the encryption piece. And we didn't worry about this remote access and doing more stuff potentially. It was just service got deployed on somebody's PC, looked for a bunch of open window shares, they would encrypt that data. So we would say, hey, if you've got storage snapshots, that's a layer of protection because encryption isn't going to be applicable there, right? It's not an active SMB or CIF share. But now that we're talking about people getting remote access to your environment, well, it's another story. When they've got remote access, it's game over. And you can see once the attacks start, and I think this probably is all common sense, but just in case anybody wondered, it doesn't stop until everything's been encrypted that can be encrypted, or you go in and actively shut it down. Those are the two ways that it's going to happen. So we'll talk a little bit about Veeam, ways that we can detect some of that stuff. And so finally, after they've done all that, they've done their 4 stages, that's when they come out, inform you in some fashion, you've been hacked. We would like, $1 billion. Maybe not $1 billion, but they want, a whole bunch of money in Bitcoin, typically. And the exfiltration, that's where it's going to come into play. We've also got this data that we're going to make public if you don't pay us. They may even give you a sample decryption key, by the way, to say we'll allow you, free trial, you can decrypt 10 of your files, no charge. And then pay us if you want to be able to decrypt the rest. And then if you fail to negotiate with them, that's when they'll start doing stuff. That's when they'll say, we're going to leak data, we're going to do this and that. All the more reason why it's important, contact the FBI if this happens, because if you get hit, just because you don't know what the attackers are going to try to do. If you have backups, though, that you can rely on, that at least will help you with getting data back without having to pay money. Again, if you've got exfiltration, that's something that you still have to deal with. But if you don't have that and you're just worried about getting your data back, the big thing is being able to recover from a backup. You can see that 80% of the companies that refused to pay the ransom did so because they had backups they could rely upon. So then you ask, what about the other 20%? There's some people that just say start over, which is pretty scary. But in some cases, it's just depending upon what was hit, they may have the ability to rebuild. But most of the time, we can't just say start over, rebuild. So you do want to make sure you've got some kind of good backup to be able to recover from. All right, some more stats. So let's talk a little bit about that with Veeam. Some of these are best practices. Some of these don't even necessarily apply just to Veeam, like this first one here. Make sure you have secure credentials for your backup environment. Don't just use domain admin for everything. It's very easy to do, very tempting sometimes because, domain admin's got rights to everything. But that also means an attacker comes in, they can grab those creds, they can do a lot of stuff. So you want to use something that doesn't have a lot of privileges, maybe even a non-domain account. Now, if you start dealing with workgroup machines, sometimes that's difficult to manage. So I've also seen where folks will deploy a whole separate AD domain as just the authentication realm for the backup environment. No trust relationships, so it's a completely isolated authentication domain. So that's a key thing. Another thing, too, is to look at MFA for gaining access to any of your servers that are running Veeam services. Now, Veeam does not have MFA built in, but there's people like Duo that offer MFA solutions. So you could take a look at implementing that so you've at least got MFA to be able to log into those Windows boxes running things. Now, these days, a lot of the Veeam services actually can run on Linux, which is nice. The main backup server still has to be Windows, but just about everything else can be Linux, if that's your preference from a security standpoint. I also like to say keep the enemy guessing. Because, again, if you look at least the encryption piece, because they still are doing that. Even though there's a lot of other stuff they can do, they'll still be looking at what can I encrypt. Typically, they're going to still look at SMB and CIF shares for that activity, because that's the easiest thing to hit. So that's why we say, well, maybe use a purpose-built appliance. You can see some sample ones here: Dell EMC, HPE, Exagrid, all offer solutions that have integration with Veeam. And in one way, shape, or form, like Dell EMC and HPE, both even offer their own proprietary means of communicating with the box. Exagrid, we treat it more like Linux for communications, or just Linux on its own, and we'll talk about in a second why that actually could be beneficial. But all of these at least give something that will make it a little bit more difficult for the attacker to find something. Those are just one piece of a broader story here that we call a scale-out backup repository. That concept is not new. It's been here since version 9, so that's probably 6 years old, I want to say, if I remember right. Initially, this feature was just designed as an easy way to scale up your storage in your environment. So you could say, hey, as I run out of space, I'm going to bring in another box. I'm pooling everything together, and I can just expand that way. It also allows me to retire old stuff because I can kind of take it offline, move stuff off of it. Backups still work because they're going to the logical concept of the scale out. But as time went on, we realized that's also a great way of doing kind of infinite scalability by leveraging the cloud. So if anyone is looking at public cloud, you would see hooks there to AWS, to Microsoft, IBM. We'll talk a little bit about ways we can leverage IP pathways, right? This is more the hyperscalers. Google is a relatively new one, as of version 11. That's in there as well, Google Cloud Storage. But the point being is we said, look, let's get off site, because again, at least that's data they can't encrypt. Now, potentially, could an attacker delete that if they gain access to your Veeam server? Yes, which is why it's important to look at immutability. I've got another slide specifically on that, but of all the hyperscalers at least, again, a little bit different from Cloud Connect, which we'll talk about in a second, but from a hyperscaler aspect, Amazon has had something called Object Lock built into the S3 spec for a number of years, and we fully support that. So if you do copy backups to S3, or even use Glacier for longer term or cost-effective storage, you can check boxes in Veeam that just say, make these immutable. So once it's immutable, for anyone not familiar with the term, that means I cannot modify or delete that backup data for X number of days. And you specify that in the policy settings. And that's all just part of this scale out. So you build this thing for landing backups initially and say copy it to public cloud. From there, tier it to more public cloud options. That's the archive tier. That's the Glacier stuff, or Azure archive tier. But again, with immutability there. Microsoft had been trialing their version of this. I believe theirs just went GA, I want to say in the last 2 months. So we'll be working on seeing how we add official support for their version of it as well. But Amazon's got it. So it's another thing when we start looking at how do you protect data. I just had to look the other day because I was working with a public sector customer in Kentucky who was worried about this because he had in his mind air gap means completely offline, like tape or removable drives, which, by the way, you don't really hear me talking about here. Very viable options, right? I'm looking at things that, in my mind, are a little bit easier to manage than tape. Anyone using tapes knows what I'm talking about. They work. They're very inexpensive, but it's a pain. And then if you get it, move your tapes off site, Iron Mountain, something like that. If you ever had to recover from it, you got to recall those tapes from Iron Mountain. You got to get them loaded in your library. You got to start restoring. How long is it going to take you just to get to the point so you can restore? And that's why we talk about things that are online but have a ways to be able to still lock themselves down so that attackers can't delete those backups. So to me, these are still another form of air gap solutions without just being 100% physically offline, if you will. So with that being said, this one customer didn't believe it. He's like, unless it's tape, it's not air gap. And so I actually sent him a link to Amazon's site, which shows that they had an independent party do testing on S3, which verified it meets the worm criteria, for write once, read many. Immutability is just another way of saying worm storage, by the federal government for finance customers, at least. So there's SEC rules and other rules that finance has to deal with. So if it meets the federal guidelines for that, it's pretty safe stuff, which is well and good. But how about your on-premises environment? So earlier I mentioned Linux as a way to keep people guessing, and I said I'd talk more about that in a minute. That same immutability concept that I've been harping on the last couple of minutes for S3, also available with an on-premises Veeam repository running on Linux. right? So just commodity hardware, whatever kind of x86 box you like, Dell, HP, Cisco, I don't care. I found a customer running Fujitsu. When they told me that, I said, Fujitsu, don't they just make drives? But apparently they make servers. Don't really care. If Linux can run on it and you can put some storage in it, it could be a repository. Might be a little bit difficult to see, but it's just a checkbox saying make backups immutable for X number of days, just like with the public cloud story. And then we do everything on the back end. So we need credentials one time and one time only to deploy our credentials. To deploy our services, rather. I should actually, to be a little bit more correct, anytime you would do a Veeam upgrade, we would need credentials again because we're upgrading that service. Outside of that, we don't need credentials because we use PKI for authentication. You could also shut off SSH to the box because it's just direct communications from the Veeam proxy server to our data mover service running on the box. So you basically cut this thing down that unless you've got physical access, you can't hurt the box. So if you've got people that are walking around your data center with sledgehammers, I can't fix that problem. Short of that, you're good. So that's another thing. And we use the same independent party that Amazon did, which again verified this Linux capability as meeting the worm storage needs of the U.S. finance sector. So it's pretty cool stuff at that point. So local stuff, immutable, offsite copy, immutable. So now we can make certain that when those guys are coming in and doing some nasty stuff, you got something to recover from. For those of you that are maybe using IP pathways as a Veeam cloud provider, it's an interesting feature we've got with Cloud Connect. A little bit different from what the hyperscalers do. In this case, it's not immutable, but that's not a bad thing. So an attacker would come in and think they deleted everything because if they got access to your console, right-click delete, looks like all your cloud backups are gone. Why that's actually a good thing is because it gets them to start looking at other stuff. They didn't get an immediate notification, but what happened on the back end is it wasn't deleted. It was just moved into a recycle bin. So Veeam calls this feature insider protection because originally the idea was you got to worry about people on the inside causing problems. Yeah, that's true, but it's kind of turned into, as time has gone on, really another type of ransomware protection. So you can really layer this thing multiple ways. On premises, more of like a private managed cloud through IP pathways, public cloud. There's a lot of ways of either completely blocking it from being deleted altogether, or at least when it's deleted, it's not really deleted, and you just make a simple phone call and say, I need it back. Right? But these are all things to think about how you can layer your strategy. And no one ever has to decide from day one which way they want to go. Implement something, and you can always, over time, add some of the other capabilities on. Because all this stuff's built in on the Veeam side. There's nothing extra from a Veeam license that you need. Now, you're going to pay the provider, for their storage. That's between you and whoever you're using as a provider. But from a Veeam perspective, it's all built in. And so all those options come to what we used to just call the 3-2-1 rule, which a lot of other vendors use too, to say you should have 3 copies of your data, so the production copy plus 2 backups on at least 2 different media, one of those off-site, because that's what we were worried about. But with ransomware coming in, not just one off-site, but the additional one is to make sure it's air-gapped or immutable. And then the 0 means no errors, because that's another nice thing for those of you that are not Veeam customers, or even if you are, you may not be using a feature called Sure Backup, but it allows you to actually spin up your VMs right from the backup repository. It gets put in an isolated sandbox environment from a network perspective. We reach in, do tests. If everything is good, that tells you your backups are good. So another nice thing. The zip code of availability, 32110. Sorry. I did not make it up, but I do like it, so I use it. I sold the joke. You also want to, just as a good general concept, secure your data by using additional encryption. So in addition to the immutability piece, one is you can encrypt data at rest with Veeam. But this screenshot is also showing encrypting network traffic. Because a lot of times that's forgotten. Because for encrypting the data at rest, that's done in the backup job. And so if you're configuring backup jobs, you see that all the time. But often I find customers don't go into the network rules section of the console. They're not aware of the fact that there is encryption that can be turned on. There's also throttling if you ever needed it. But that's another thing too, because again, when they're doing that discovery phase, trying to see what's out there, you don't want them to be sniffing traffic and see plain text stuff going across the wire while backups are running. So that's another thing that it's not going to keep them from getting in your environment, but at least it's going to give them less that they can try to go after. If you do get hit, you have to look at how quickly can you recover. So one of the options here is if you take your environment and replicate it to another environment, so VMware to VMware, Hyper-V to Hyper-V, you can leverage IP pathways potentially as that second target, do it more as like a DR as a service. Doesn't matter. Point is, you manage it on the Veeam side, control it on the Veeam side, so that you can actually fail over to those virtual machines. And the reason I highlight that is, again, if they've come in and they've encrypted everything, instead of sitting here and having yourselves be down the whole time it takes to recover data, which could take a while, just depends on how much data you've got and what kind of network you've got. If I could just spin them up in a DR site on a moment's notice, I've got the organization running. Now, you probably want to make sure you've cleaned up the ransomware first, because you don't want to spin that up and all of a sudden that gets infected, right? So shut down the attack, be confident that it's shut down, and then now you can leverage this piece. And there's a nice little animation showing it going across. Now, how do you detect something's going on? A lot of security vendors in the space. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time talking about that, but I do want to talk a little bit about what Veeam can do from a monitoring aspect. So who here is familiar with something called Veeam 1? I'm just kind of curious. Anyone? A couple people? All right. So Veeam 1, great solution. We've had it for years. If any of you have either Veeam Backup Essentials or Veeam Availability Suite, either of those packagings actually give you Veeam 1. It's just our monitoring / reporting solution. Originally was built to be able to report on what's going on with your VMware environment, your Hyper-V environment, the Veeam backup environment. But as part of that, we've introduced ways to try to detect ransomware. Again, a little difficult to see, but in these screenshots, it's showing an alert called possible ransomware activity. In this screenshot, the next one on top of it is just showing the rules to define it. So if we see high CPU going on, if we see a lot of network access going on, if we see a lot of disk activity, it means that either something's installed on a box and it's encrypting itself, or something is encrypting across the network. Potentially, right? We say possible because there could be legitimate reasons, like a busy SQL server could have high CPU and high disk writes. No encryption going on, just normal SQL stuff. Now, you can always tweak this too, so instead of monitoring the whole environment, maybe exclude SQL or only monitor certain things you're worried about. But the point being is, at least we can give you a heads up that something might be going on in the environment. And if you've got a ticketing system, now this screenshot's just talking about ServiceNow, doesn't have to be ServiceNow, but when the alert gets created, you can actually send a notification to your ticketing system and get a ticket to be opened automatically, so that way this gets routed to IT properly. Or you just have the alerts go to yourselves as long as you're checking your email or you've got something else taking SNMP traps. Doesn't matter what it is. But it is kind of interesting that Veeam could potentially detect ransomware and get a trouble ticket open for you, right? Another thing, too, is suspicious incremental backup size. It's another alert. This one's a little bit newer. If your data's been encrypted, when it gets backed up, it's going to look like all brand new data. So if, let's say, normally on a nightly basis, you're backing up 100 gigs of data, but all of a sudden, out of the blue one night, you back up 2 terabytes, and you know you didn't create like a bunch of new VMs, you know no one did a data dump, this could tell you that maybe you've been hit, right? So go take a look at those particular virtual machines that have had these much larger incremental backups than normal to see if something's going on. And then the rest of this is just default rules. You can always tweak all the rules as far as what Veeam 1's detecting. Another thing from kind of a reporting type of deal, if you had to recover, like let's say you got hit by ransomware, as far as you know you've cleaned it up, now you need to recover a virtual machine. But what you don't know is how long had the ransomware attack been dormant in your environment. Because maybe this VM that you're going to do a restore from a week ago is just going to reintroduce things. I heard one case, the longest I've ever heard is a year. This was some customer in Wisconsin got hit. Ransomware came in, sat there dormant for a year before it finally triggered. Because they're just trying to outlive your retention. So built into Veeam, when you do a full VM restore, you can actually say, scan this thing for malware. And turn this on. It's a feature called Secure Restore. So if you turn that on, what will happen is we mount the disks, and then we scan them with whatever type of anti-malware, antivirus have to be sitting on one of the Veeam servers, gateway in this case. And the idea behind that is maybe it didn't get picked up initially, that's how you got infected, but since then you've had pattern updates that your solution today could detect it. So let's go ahead and do a scan of this before we ever power on the VM. Right? So mount the disks, check it. If we do detect something, what do? So we can come out here and either say boot it up, but don't connect it to the network, don't connect the VNix, or just abort, right? So a couple of options. But the whole point is we can check what's out there before. So this doesn't tell you as it's happening, but at least prevents you from reinfecting yourself. So with that, bring it to a close. Any questions from anyone? All right. Hopefully it made sense or I bored everyone. But either way, thank you for your time.